Total defeat. That's a massive claim, one of the biggest, most absolute words you can possibly put in a war headline. So let's actually test it against the data, methodically, source by source, because one of the most respected conflict analysis groups covering this exact war published a report calling this something completely different just weeks ago. Not defeat, not victory, a stalemate. Let's go through exactly why, and let's let the actual numbers do the talking instead of the headline. Former combat fighter pilot here, F-15E, Thunderbird pilot, years flying commercial jets after that. I don't throw around words like total defeat lightly, not in this video and not anywhere else, and neither should anyone covering a war this genuinely complicated. Let's actually look at the evidence, source by source, number by number, instead of just accepting whichever framing happens to sound most satisfying or most shareable in a given moment. I want to set the standard for this entire breakdown right up front before we get into a single specific number. Every single claim I make from here forward is going to trace back to a named source, a research organization, a shipping data provider, a government statement, not a vague sense of who seems to be winning based on vibes or which side's press releases happen to sound more confident this week. That's the only honest, responsible way to evaluate a claim this sweeping and this absolute total defeat, because a claim that big deserves evidence at least as big and as carefully sourced to actually back it up. Here's the specific claim fueling this exact headline, and it's a real one, worth taking seriously before we pick it apart. Iran's chief negotiator publicly declared that the Strait of Hormuz would, quote, never return to pre-war conditions. Defiant language, a country digging in, refusing to concede control of the waterway. And then, seemingly right on cue, ship crossings through that exact strait jumped dramatically. Lloyd's List intelligence tracked at least 576 transits through the strait in June, up from just 233 in May. More than double in a single month. So sit with that contrast for a second, because it's genuinely the entire engine behind this headline. Iran says never. The ships say otherwise. That looks, on the surface, like total defeat. I want to walk through exactly why that surface reading feels so convincing, because understanding the trap helps you spot the exact same trick the next time it shows up in a completely different headline about a completely different war. A defiant quote plus a dramatic sounding number equals an irresistible narrative. Defiant leader proven wrong by reality within weeks. It's clean. It's satisfying. It fits neatly into a thumbnail. The only problem is it skips the one number that actually tells you whether that traffic bump means anything at all. Quick pause here, because the real number is actually more interesting than tripled, and I want you to have it before I tell you why it doesn't mean what you think. Follow now if you want the full picture, because there's a second number sitting right next to that one that completely changes the story. Here's the number that got left out. 576 transits in June 2026. In June of 2025, 1 year earlier, before any of this war ever started, the strait saw 3,131 transits in that same single month. Read those two numbers side by side, slowly, because the gap between them is the entire correction this video exists to make. 576, 3,131. That's not a strait bouncing back to normal. That's a strait running at roughly 18% of its pre-war traffic, even after more than doubling from its lowest point. 18%. That's the real number sitting underneath a headline about total defeat. Let me put that 18% figure into an even more concrete picture, because raw percentages can be hard to actually feel. Before this war, roughly 100 ships a day were moving through that strait. At the peak of the June recovery, we're talking about somewhere closer to 19 ships a day on average across the month. That's not a strait bustling back to life. That's a strait still running at a fraction of a normal Tuesday from before any of this started, dressed up as a comeback because the previous month had been even worse. Picture that difference physically for a second. 100 ships a day used to mean a fairly constant, steady stream of traffic through one of the busiest waterways on the planet. 19 ships a day means long stretches of empty water where there should be constant activity. Ports operating at a fraction of capacity. An entire regional economy built around that traffic, still waiting for something close to normal to actually return. Let me give you more context on why that traffic even increased at all, because it's not because Iran backed down. Most of that June jump came from ships that had been physically stuck inside the Persian Gulf since the war began, trapped there for months, finally getting a narrow window to leave, following the June 17th ceasefire announcement. About 70% of June's transits were non-Iranian ships making a run for the exit, not new traffic choosing to enter. Lloyd's List's own editor-in-chief said directly that current traffic levels do not yet represent, in his words, the new normal for the strait. That's an evacuation, not a recovery. Ships trapped for months finally getting out is not the same thing as international shipping deciding the strait is safe again. There's actually a number that makes this even clearer. The International Maritime Organization's own Secretary General said, even after that June surge, roughly 6,000 seafarers remained stranded in the region. 6,000 people still stuck. Weeks after the supposed breakthrough this headline is built around, that's not what a resolved crisis looks like from the perspective of the actual sailors living through it, the ones sitting on ships in a war zone with no clear timeline for when they might actually get to go home to their own families. Think about what that actually means for 6,000 individual people, not just as an abstract statistic. Every single one of those seafarers has a family, somewhere waiting for news, a job they can't leave, a life on pause, because a strait halfway around the world hasn't actually stabilized the way a triumphant headline might suggest. That's the kind of human cost that never makes it into a 4-word thumbnail, but it's exactly the kind of detail that separates a genuinely resolved crisis from one that's simply had a good news cycle. Now let's get to the actual sourced expert assessment that directly contradicts this entire total defeat framing, because this is the part that matters most. On July 13th, the Soufan Center, a respected international security research group that's been tracking this war closely, published an assessment with a bottom line up front that reads almost like a direct rebuttal to this headline. Their conclusion, word for word in substance, the US-Iran conflict will remain in a, quote, no war, no peace status indefinitely, because neither side is able to deter the other, but both are trying to avoid returning to major combat. Let me tell you a bit about who the Soufan Center actually is, because I think it matters for how much weight you put on their assessment. This isn't a random blog or a partisan outlet with an obvious stake in one side winning. It's a nonpartisan research organization founded by a former FBI agent, staffed largely by former intelligence and counterterrorism professionals, specifically built to produce sober, credentialed analysis for exactly this kind of complex international conflict. When an organization like that publishes a formal bottom line describing a war as an unresolved stalemate, that carries real analytical weight, considerably more than a single dramatic headline built around one favorable statistic. No war, no peace. Neither side able to deter the other, month after month. That's about as far from total defeat as a formal analysis can possibly get. The Soufan Center went even further, and this is worth hearing in full because it's genuinely striking language from a serious research organization. They wrote that the United States might have reached what they called a, quote, strategic dead end, in which it cannot accomplish its core goals with any level of escalation that Congress or the American public would actually accept. Meanwhile, they noted Iranian hardliners judged that maintaining control of the strait provides Iran greater leverage and strategic benefit than engaging with promises of economic benefit from Washington. Read that twice. A strategic dead end. Not a headline calling it that for clicks. A named, credentialed research organization in a formal, carefully worded, published assessment using exactly that phrase about the American position specifically. I want to unpack why that specific phrase, strategic dead end, is such a loaded piece of analysis to apply to a superpower's military position. It doesn't mean the United States lacks the raw military capability to escalate further. Everything we've covered throughout this entire war shows exactly the opposite. Repeated waves of strikes, an active naval blockade, submarine warfare, sea drones, bunker busters. What it means is that political and public tolerance for further escalation, not military capability, is the actual limiting factor. That's a genuinely different kind of constraint than running out of weapons or capability. And it's exactly the kind of nuance a headline about total defeat completely erases. Think about how that constraint actually functions in practice, because it's worth understanding beyond just the label. Every additional round of American strikes carries real political cost domestically. Congressional pushback, war funding debates, public fatigue with a conflict that started back in February and shows no sign of a clean resolution. That's not a constraint Iran faces in the same way. Its government doesn't answer to the same kind of electoral or congressional pressure the American system does. That asymmetry, one side facing genuine domestic political limits on escalation, the other facing a different set of pressures entirely, is part of why analysts like the Soufan Center describe this specific standoff as a genuine dead end rather than a fight. Either side can simply out-escalate its way through. Drop a comment with the word stalemate if you want me tracking this specific no war, no peace framing going forward, because I think it's a far more accurate lens for this entire conflict than any single dramatic headline claiming either total victory or total defeat. Let me walk you through why the underlying dispute never actually got resolved, because it explains both the traffic numbers and the stalemate assessment at the same time. Iran never actually lost physical or practical control over who moves through that strait. The Washington Institute, a separate policy research group, published its own analysis just days after that June traffic bump, warning explicitly that constricted traffic patterns, escalating Iranian warnings, uncertain mine threats, and continued drone attacks all suggested, in their words, Tehran has no intention of willingly going back to business as usual in the strait, regardless of diplomatic breakthroughs. That's the whole story in one sentence. Diplomatic breakthroughs on paper. Zero actual change in who controls the water underneath those ships. Let me actually walk through what that Washington Institute report described mechanically, because it's more specific than just a vague warning. It pointed to constricted traffic patterns, meaning ships were still being funneled through narrow Iranian-monitored corridors rather than freely choosing their own routes, essentially requiring foreign commercial vessels to operate on terms Tehran set rather than terms international maritime law would normally guarantee. It pointed to ongoing mine risk, meaning the physical threat that shut the strait down in the first place hadn't actually been cleared, just temporarily worked around by ships willing to gamble on a narrow, unofficial safe corridor. And it pointed to a new drone attack, happening even in the same window as this supposedly positive traffic recovery. Direct evidence that Iran was still actively demonstrating its ability to threaten the waterway, even while ships were cautiously starting to move through it again, almost as if to remind everyone watching exactly whose permission that traffic was actually operating under. I also want to give you a specific detail from even earlier in this war, because it shows this pattern of shipping traffic ebbing and flowing without ever reflecting a genuine resolution has repeated itself multiple times already. Back in April, during an earlier 2-week ceasefire between Tehran and Washington, maritime traffic through the Strait remained restricted at nearly 95% below pre-war levels, even with a ceasefire technically in place. Most ships moving at that point were specifically Iranian-linked vessels, so-called dark fleet tankers, or ships flying flags from countries Iran considered non-hostile, like Russia and China. In other words, this exact same pattern, a ceasefire announced, traffic barely budging, Iran still functionally controlling who actually gets to move, happened once already back in April, months before the June numbers this specific headline is built around, and it dissolved back into fighting, just as this June episode eventually did too. That's the part I really want you to sit with, because it changes how you should read any future ceasefire announcement in this exact war going forward. This isn't the first time a diplomatic breakthrough produced a temporary traffic bump that got read as a turning point, only to collapse weeks later back into active fighting. It's at least the second time, following almost the exact same shape both times. Initial optimism, a modest recovery in shipping numbers, premature declarations of victory or defeat, depending on which side is doing the declaring, and then a return to exactly the same unresolved dispute over who actually controls that waterway. Here's how badly this defeat narrative actually aged, because I want to give you the full current picture, not just the June snapshot this headline is built around. That June 17th ceasefire, the one that produced this traffic bump in the first place, didn't hold. On July 6th and 7th, Iran attacked 3 separate commercial tankers in the Strait. The U.S. responded with more than 80 strikes inside Iran, and it kept escalating from there. Let me actually walk you through that collapse in a bit more detail, because it happened remarkably fast once it started. The ceasefire held for roughly 3 weeks, from June 17th to early July, just barely long enough to produce that traffic bump this headline is built around. Then within about 48 hours of the first tanker attack, American retaliatory strikes had already grown to more than 80 separate targets. Within another week and a half, Iranian officials were describing strikes across 12 different cities and 95 separate locations. That's the actual trajectory hiding underneath a headline, still built around the June numbers, a brief window of calm, followed by one of the most intense stretches of this entire war, proving in real time exactly how premature any total defeat, framing from that earlier June moment, actually turned out to be within a matter of days. By roughly a week ago, independent tracking of this conflict reported both sides had formally declared that original agreement, the Islamabad Memorandum, completely void. Iran's deputy foreign minister said Tehran has, quote, no commitments under it anymore. Trump called it, quote, a test they failed. Oil production across Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE reportedly fell by an estimated 6.7 million barrels a day, as tankers once again couldn't reliably transit the strait. Yemen's Houthi movement threatened to close the Red Sea too, meaning both of the 2 major alternate energy corridors risked simultaneous disruption at the exact same time. Let me actually sit with that Red Sea detail for a second, because I don't think it gets nearly enough attention relative to how serious it actually is. The Strait of Hormuz and the route around the Cape of Good Hope, which ships use specifically to avoid the Red Sea when the Suez Canal route is too risky, are the 2 primary alternatives global shipping relies on when either corridor becomes too dangerous. A credible threat to disrupt both simultaneously isn't a regional shipping inconvenience anymore. It's a genuine risk to global energy and goods movement on a scale this entire conflict hadn't previously threatened, even at its worst points earlier in the year, and it's exactly the kind of escalation you'd expect from a side that felt cornered or defeated, rather than one still confident enough to open an entirely new front on top of an already sprawling conflict. That's not total defeat for Iran. If anything, that's a country that walked away from a deal it had already gotten meaningful benefit from, and escalated anyway. betting that continued disruption serves its interests more than compliance does. I also want to give you the most current update I could find, because this story keeps moving even as I'm recording this. Just recently, reporting indicated the US and Iran paused attacks again after several more days of escalation. So even that most recent pause isn't being framed anywhere as a defeat for either side. It's being covered exactly the way the Soufan Center predicted weeks earlier. Another temporary lull inside an ongoing, unresolved, no war, no peace cycle. Let me actually flag something about that most recent pause specifically, because I think it deserves a healthy amount of skepticism given everything we've already covered. This is not the first pause in this conflict. It's not the second either. There was an earlier 2-week ceasefire back in April. There was the June 17th memorandum that produced the traffic numbers this entire headline is built around. Both of those paused, and both of those eventually broke down into renewed fighting. A pattern that's repeated at least twice already doesn't automatically mean this. Most recent pause will follow the exact same path, but it does mean treating any single pause as a final decisive conclusion. In either direction has already been proven wrong by this exact same war multiple times over. Let me give you the actual human and material cost of this entire 9-month stretch too, because total defeat implies some kind of clean final scoreline, and the real numbers are nowhere close to that. Depending on which source you're reading, reported American military deaths across this conflict range from 13 to 15, with hundreds more wounded. Reported Iranian casualties vary even more wildly depending on the source. Iran's own figures cite a few thousand killed, while American and Israeli sources have claimed Iranian military losses several times higher than that. Kuwait alone reported 4 of its own service members killed defending against Iranian strikes, plus civilian casualties. The gap between different sides' casualty claims is itself worth noting, because it tells you nobody involved has full, independently verified command of the actual toll, let alone a clean, confirmable win. Let me actually walk through why that casualty gap is so wide, because it's a genuinely important detail for understanding how contested even the basic facts of this war remain. Iran's own reported figures for its own losses tend to be lower, which is fairly typical for a government reporting its own casualties during an active conflict. Wartime reporting on your own losses almost always skews conservative for morale and security reasons. American and Israeli sources, working primarily from strike assessments, satellite imagery, and intelligence estimates rather than ground-level Iranian reporting, have claimed considerably higher Iranian military losses, sometimes several multiples higher than Iran's own stated numbers. Neither side has strong incentive to be fully accurate here. One wants to minimize domestic panic and appear resilient. The other wants to demonstrate the campaign's effectiveness. The truth almost certainly sits somewhere between those two competing sets of numbers, and I genuinely can't tell you exactly where with full confidence, which is itself the point. A war this contested doesn't produce the kind of clean, agreed-upon numbers a total defeat storyline would require you to simply accept at face value. None of that reads like a tidy story where one side simply trapped the other into surrender. It reads like a brutal, expensive, unresolved war that both sides are still actively paying for, in lives and in money, with no side able to point to a moment where the other clearly folded. Let me also flag the economic angle, because this is the part that actually reaches you personally, regardless of where you live. The blockade phase of this conflict was reportedly costing Iran roughly $500 million a day at its peak. According to American estimates, a genuinely brutal number for any economy to absorb for months at a stretch. But even that pressure didn't produce capitulation. 26 vessels still found ways to bypass the blockade according to Lloyd's List tracking, and Iran seized 2 cargo ships of its own in direct retaliation. Real economic pain on Iran's side, real defiance continuing anyway. That combination, genuine cost without genuine surrender, is exactly what a stalemate actually looks like in practice, not what a total defeat looks like. I want to put that $500 million a day figure in perspective too, because it's an enormous number that's easy to read past without really absorbing it. Over just 30 days, that's $15 billion in estimated economic pressure on an economy already strained by years of prior sanctions predating this war entirely. That's the kind of sustained economic damage that would, in almost any other scenario, be expected to force real concessions. The fact that it didn't, that Iran kept finding ways around the blockade and kept escalating rather than folding, is itself some of the strongest evidence against a total defeat framing that exists anywhere in this entire story. Because a government genuinely on the brink of total defeat doesn't typically respond to $15 billion a month in economic pressure by opening new fronts and attacking additional tankers rather than negotiating harder for relief. Here's my honest read on why a headline like this one gets built in the first place. Because I think the mechanics are worth understanding. Pick the single most favorable data point, a doubling of shipping traffic in one specific month, strip out the comparison that would put it in real context, the fact that it's still just 18% of normal, and pair it with an opponent's most defiant quote to make that quote sound like it's already been proven wrong. That's a genuinely effective formula for a dramatic headline. It's also, based on everything we just walked through, not an accurate description of where this conflict actually stands. I think this specific technique, isolating one genuinely real but incomplete statistic and building an entire narrative around it, deserves its own name, because you're going to see it again in this war and in plenty of others. It's not lying exactly. Every individual number in a headline built this way is usually technically accurate. It's selection, choosing which true fact to lead with and which true fact to leave out entirely in a way that flips the actual meaning of the story. A doubling sounds impressive on its own. A doubling that still leaves you at 18% of normal sounds like exactly what it is. A war still very much unresolved. Once you learn to spot that specific move, leading with a percentage change while burying the actual baseline it's measured against, you'll start noticing it everywhere, not just in coverage of this war. It shows up in economic reporting, in public health statistics, in literally any story built around a number that sounds dramatic in isolation, but only tells half the actual picture without its proper context sitting right next to it. Let me also address something directly, because I think it's worth naming. This isn't really a story about Iran being weak or Iran being strong, and it's not really a story about America being weak or America being strong either. It's a story about how a single, cherry-picked statistic can be technically true and still create a completely false overall impression, simply by leaving out the one comparison that would have told you what that statistic actually means. That's a pattern worth watching for in literally any conflict coverage you encounter going forward, not just this specific war. Let me leave you with the accurate version, stated plainly. Iran's negotiator really did say the strait would never return to pre-war conditions. Ship traffic really did jump significantly in June. Both of those things are true. What's also true, and what the headline leaves out entirely, is that the jump represented trapped ships finally escaping, rather than new confidence in the strait, that traffic still sat at roughly 18% of pre-war levels, even at its best point, that a respected named research organization explicitly called this a stalemate and a potential strategic dead end for the United States specifically, and that the ceasefire producing that traffic bump in the first place collapsed within weeks, dragging the region back into active fighting that both sides ultimately declared the entire prior agreement void over. Let me actually connect every single one of those threads together in one place, because I think seeing the full chain makes the corrected picture click. A ceasefire gets signed in mid-June, trapped ships flee the moment it's safe enough to try. That evacuation gets misread as a genuine recovery. 3 weeks later, Iran attacks tankers again, proving that reading wrong. America responds with 80 plus strikes. Within days, both governments formally declare the entire original deal void. A respected research organization, watching this exact sequence unfold in real time, concludes neither side can actually force the other's hand. And through all of it, oil production drops, a new blockade threat opens on a completely separate waterway, and stranded sailors are still waiting to get home months after the war technically started. That's not total defeat. That's not total victory either. It's a genuinely unresolved, expensive, still ongoing war, with both sides absorbing real costs and neither one able to force the other's hand. If this actually helped you see past a single misleading data point dressed up as a decisive conclusion, share it with someone still repeating the idea that this war basically ended sometime back in June, because based on everything confirmed since, including formal declarations from both governments that the agreement is void, it clearly didn't. I want to be honest about one more thing before we close. I'm not telling you Iran is winning either. Nothing in the reporting here supports that framing any more than it supports total defeat. What the actual evidence supports is exactly what the Soufan Center called it. Neither side able to deter the other, both sides trying to avoid a full return to major combat, and mediators still searching for a formula that might actually hold, rather than one more temporary pause waiting to collapse the same way the last one did. Let me actually give you a simple way to think about this going forward, because I think it's more useful than trying to keep score between total victory and total defeat every single week. Watch 3 specific indicators instead. Watch actual shipping traffic as a percentage of pre-war levels, not just the month-over-month change. Because the percentage tells you the real story a percentage change can hide. Watch whether attacks on commercial vessels actually stop, not just pause, because a pause has already happened multiple times in this war and hasn't held yet. And watch whether any future agreement actually specifies who controls passage through the strait in enforceable, unambiguous terms, rather than the kind of vague language that let both sides walk away from the June memorandum claiming the other side broke it. Those 3 indicators, Real percentage of normal traffic, an actual sustained stop in attacks rather than a pause, and a genuinely unambiguous agreement on control of the strait would tell you far more about who's actually winning this conflict than any single dramatic headline built around one favorable month of data ever could. Let me give you one final thought before we wrap, because I think it ties everything together. Wars like this one rarely end with a single clean moment where everyone agrees who won and who lost. They end, when they actually end, through a slow, grinding accumulation of exhaustion, economic pressure, and diplomatic compromise on both sides, not through one side, simply trapping the other into a headline-worthy surrender. Watching for that slow, unglamorous process is a lot less satisfying than believing a single dramatic headline. But it's the version that's actually been true so far. Every single time, this exact war has produced one of these supposedly decisive moments. If you want me tracking those 3 specific indicators going forward, rather than reacting to whichever headline happens to be trending that week, drop a comment saying so, because I think that's a genuinely more useful way to actually follow this story than getting pulled between total victory and total defeat headlines every single time the numbers shift even slightly in either direction. Thanks for sticking with the real numbers instead of the headlines version of them. I'll keep tracking this one as it keeps developing, because if the pattern of the last 9 months tells us anything, it's that this specific story is far from over. I'll see you in the next one.